Selina Montley had spent the better part of an hour counting the roses rather than the dancers, because roses did not look at her the way people did. She sat where she always sat, near the tall windows, half hidden by a potted fern that Lady Winslow's gardener had clearly been instructed to make imposing rather than pretty, and watched her sisters turn beneath the chandeliers like two bright coins tossed into a fountain. Harriet's laugh carried even over the quartet. Julia's new gown, sea-green silk that Selina herself had taken in at the waist 2 nights before by candlelight, caught the light every time she spun. No one asked Selina to dance. No one ever did. She had made her peace with this so thoroughly and so long ago that when her cousin Francis leaned close and whispered, "I dare you to speak to him," Selina did not immediately understand who him might be. Then she followed the tilt of Francis's chin and understood at once. He stood near the card-room doorway as though he had wandered there by accident and could not now recall how to leave, tall and dark-coated among the peacock silks, a man built along severe lines, not unhandsome, but arranged, somehow, like a house with all its curtains drawn. She knew him only by reputation, which was a considerable thing to know a man by, because reputation had made him into something between a ghost story and a warning. The Duke of Oakhaven, widower, recluse. Cold, they said, though no one could quite say what unkindness he had ever actually done. Cold seemed to mean only that he did not smile, did not court, did not explain himself to a room that felt entitled to an explanation. "I couldn't," Selina said. "You could. You're the only one brave enough not to care what he thinks of you." Francis's eyes glittered with the particular mischief of a girl who has never once been made invisible by a ballroom. "Go on, just wish him good evening, that's all. A dare costs nothing." It was not true that it cost nothing. Selina's heart had already begun to beat in her throat at the very thought, but there was a peculiar freedom in being a wallflower that Francis, in all her prettiness, would never understand. No one watched Selina Montley. No one would notice if she crossed a ballroom and made a fool of herself at its far edge. She could do this small, mad thing and vanish back into her fern with no one the wiser, and something about that thought loosened her feet from the floor before her good sense could catch up to them. She crossed the room with her chin lifted, the way her mother had taught her to walk when she felt least like walking that way at all. The Duke did not see her coming. He was looking at nothing, or at everything at once, in that unfocused manner of a man enduring an evening rather than attending it, and when Selina stopped before him and said, "Good evening, Your Grace," he startled so slightly that she nearly missed it. A small tightening at the eyes, quickly smoothed away. "Good evening," he said, and then, when she did not immediately retreat, with something that was almost bewilderment, "Have we been introduced?" "No," Selina admitted. "I am Miss Montley. I do not dance, and I do not gossip, and I have been dared to speak to you, which I have now done, so you needn't trouble yourself further on my account." She heard herself say it and thought, distantly, that she had perhaps never spoken so many words in a row to a stranger in her life. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a smile, but its shadow, the memory of what a smile might once have been on that face. "An honest wallflower," he said. "I did not know the species existed." "We are rare," she agreed, "but not extinct." He looked at her properly then, and Selina had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen, which she was so unaccustomed to that she nearly stepped back. Whatever he saw seemed to trouble some private ledger he kept, for his brow creased faintly. "You mend gowns," he said. It was not a question. Selina's hand went, unconsciously, to the small callus at the side of her forefinger, the one no glove ever quite hid. "I am told it shows." Only to someone who has spent a great many hours watching hands rather than faces. He said it without cruelty, almost as an apology for having noticed at all. "My niece's nurse tells me her clothes want constant repair. She is a restless child." He stopped, as though he had said more than he intended, and something shuddered behind his face, like a door drawn quietly to. "Children generally are," Selina said gently, because his voice had changed on the word child in a way she recognized, the careful flatness of a person walking around the edge of a wound rather than through it. "Not silent ones," he said, and then, seeming to hear himself, gave a short bow. "Forgive me. I am poor company this evening, Miss Montley, and have been poor company for rather longer than that. I wish you a pleasant end to the dance." He walked away before she could answer, and Selina stood alone at the edge of the card-room, feeling, absurdly, as though she had lost something she had not known she wanted. She thought of him twice that week, which was twice more than she thought of any gentleman she had actually danced with, and both times she was ashamed of it and put the thought away like a gown too fine for daily wear. The message that arrived on Thursday, therefore, struck her with the peculiar shock of a wish granted before it has been properly wished. "Miss Montley," it read, in a hand so precise it might have been drawn with a ruler, "I write at the recommendation of Mrs. Ferris, whose sister you assisted with alterations last autumn. My niece, Miss Beatrice Ashworth, aged 7, is in want of a companion possessed of patience and needlework both, her current nurse being too advanced in years for the child's more active moods, and her wardrobe too advanced in disrepair for my household's dignity. The position would require residence at Oakhaven Park. I would be obliged if you would call upon me at your earliest convenience to discuss terms. Yours in some hope of assistance, Oakhaven." Selina read it 3 times before she showed it to her mother, who read it twice and then looked at her daughter with an expression Selina could not quite parse. Pride, perhaps, or pity, or some uncomfortable mixture of both. The look of a woman watching her plainest child offered a chance her prettier ones would never need. "A duke's household," her mother said slowly. "It is a respectable position. Better than plain sewing for hire, certainly. But Selina, do you know why he asked for you particularly? Mrs. Ferris's sister, it says. Mrs. Ferris's sister is a vicar's wife in Surrey who has met you exactly once." Her mother folded the letter along its original creases, very precisely, the way she did everything. "I think, my dear, that a certain duke remembers a certain ballroom rather better than he let on." Selina said nothing to that, because she did not trust herself to, and 3 days later she was standing before the great iron gates of Oakhaven Park with a single trunk and a heart that would not settle into any single rhythm. The house itself took her breath in a manner she had not expected. She had imagined grandeur, and there was grandeur. Gray stone rising 3 stories against a sky the color of dishwater, mullioned windows catching what little light the day offered. But what struck her first was the silence. Not the peaceful silence of a well-run home at rest, but something heavier, like a held breath. The drive was raked, but the flower beds along it were bare of anything but old growth, cut back to stubs. A fountain in the forecourt stood dry, its stone cherub holding an empty shell to a sky that gave it nothing to catch. The butler who received her, a spare, correct man named Hodges, looked at her only slightly longer than propriety allowed before saying, "His Grace is expecting you, Miss Montley. I will show you to the small drawing-room." The Duke rose when she entered, which surprised her. She had not expected him to remember such courtesies extended to a hired companion, and for a moment neither of them spoke, as though the ballroom conversation had been a dream neither wished to admit to remembering. "Miss Montley," he said at last, "you came. You wrote a very persuasive letter, Your Grace." "I wrote a very honest letter, which I am told is not always the same thing." He gestured her to a chair by the cold hearth. Cold, she noted, though the day was chill enough to want a fire, and remained standing himself, as though sitting were a commitment he was not yet ready to make. "I will not pretend the position is simple. My niece has not spoken since her parents died 8 months ago, not one word, to anyone, in any language, though her governess assures me she understands every syllable spoken to her. 3 companions have come and gone in that time. The last called her uncanny, within the child's hearing, and left within the week. Something in Selina's chest tightened, an old, familiar ache, the particular fury she reserved for cruelty dressed as candor. "Children are not uncanny for grieving, Your Grace. They are only unheard." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face eased, very slightly, like a hand unclenching. "That," he said, "is precisely why I sent for you, rather than for someone more conventionally suited to the task. Will you meet her? Beatrice Ashworth sat by the nursery window with a hoop she was not rolling and a doll she was not holding, in a room that had clearly been furnished for a happier child. A rocking horse gathering dust in one corner, a shelf of picture books whose spines had never been broken. She did not look up when Selina entered, though her eyes flicked once, quick as a bird's, and then returned to the window. "Good afternoon, Miss Beatrice," Selina said, and settled herself on the low stool near the window without waiting for an invitation that would not come. "I have brought my work-basket. I find I think better with my hands occupied than idle, and I suspect you might be the same sort of person." The child said nothing. Selina had expected nothing, and so was not disheartened. She drew out the hem of a petticoat that wanted letting down and began to sew, and let the silence sit between them, unforced, the way one might sit beside a nervous horse without reaching for its bridle. She did not attempt conversation. She did not exclaim over the doll, or the view, or the weather. She simply sewed, and hummed very softly under her breath, an old tune her own nurse had sung, something about a ship and a harbor, and watched, from the corner of her eye, as Beatrice's small hands slowly stilled their restless plucking at her skirt. After perhaps 20 minutes, the child slid off her window seat and came to stand beside Selina's stool, watching the needle. Selina did not look up, did not remark on it, only continued the small, even stitches as though nothing at all remarkable had occurred. "Would you like to try?" she asked eventually, holding out a scrap of cloth and a blunt needle threaded with bright yarn, the sort a child could not easily harm herself with. "It does not matter if the stitches are crooked. Mine were crooked for years." Beatrice looked at the needle, looked at Selina, and then, with the grave concentration of a much older person undertaking a serious task, took it. They did not speak again that afternoon. But when Hodges came to say that tea was laid, Beatrice's hand found the edge of Selina's sleeve and held it, briefly, before letting go, and Selina thought that in 7 years of being invisible, she had never once felt so thoroughly, so unexpectedly seen. Oakhaven Park, Selina came to understand within her first fortnight, was a house arranged around an absence. She learned its rhythms the way one learns a piece of music played always in a minor key. The Duke breakfasted alone. At an hour so early, the kitchen maids complained of it good-naturedly to one another. He rode out each morning, regardless of weather, returned by 10, and shut himself into the estate office until dinner, which he generally took on a tray rather than at the long table clearly built for a family grander and gayer than the one that occupied it now. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, was a formidable woman, with iron in her spine and, Selina discovered, considerable softness beneath it, once one had proven oneself worth the trouble of softening for. It was Mrs. Pruitt who told her, over a shared pot of tea in the housekeeper's parlor on a rain-soaked afternoon, the shape of the grief that lived in the house's walls. His Grace's brother, Master Edmund, and his lady wife, drowned, both of them, when their carriage went into the river at Ashford Crossing. A flood, sudden as anything, no warning at all. Little Miss Beatrice was meant to be with them, only she'd taken a fever the week before and stayed behind with her nurse. Some say that's a mercy. I say it's left that child believing she oughtn't have been spared, which is no mercy I've ever heard of. Selina's needle stilled in her lap. And His Grace? Blames himself worse than the child does herself, if you ask me, though he'd never say so plain. It was his advice sent them traveling that week, some business of the London solicitors that could as easily have waited a month. He's not spoken more than was needed to another living soul since the funeral, saving his steward and his man of business. You're the first he's let near the child at all, and I'll tell you plain, Miss Montley, half this house didn't credit it would last the fortnight. Mrs. Pruitt's sharp eyes softened, just slightly. It seems it's lasting. She let me hem her doll's gown yesterday, Selina said. She pointed to the tear. She did not speak, but she pointed. Mrs. Pruitt set down her cup with the particular care of a woman moved beyond what she wished to show. That, Miss Montley, is more than this house has had in 8 months. It was the library that first drew Selina's notice as something more than merely handsome. A long room of dark oak shelving and tall windows, half its books still wrapped in the brown paper of a move never finished, as though someone had begun to set the room to rights and then simply stopped. She found the Duke there one evening, later than she ought to have been about, having gone in search of a book of fables for Beatrice, and not expected to find him standing before the cold hearth with a single candle and an expression she was not meant to see. "Forgive me," she said at once. "I did not know you were within." "Stay," he said, before she could retreat, and then seemed startled by his own request. "That is, if you wish. I am poor company, as I believe I warned you at our first meeting, but the room is large enough for 2 silences." She stayed. She found her book and settled with it in a chair some distance from his, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, and it was, strangely, one of the more companionable evenings Selina could remember in a very great while. "My brother meant to finish unpacking these," he said eventually, without preamble, as though continuing a conversation they had been having in his head for some time. He and Charlotte were newly returned from the continent when, he stopped, began again. "They meant to make their home here, once. I offered them the dower house, but Edmund said a family ought to live under the same roof as its head, whatever that meant to him. I never asked. I ought to have asked." "You could not have known you would run out of time to ask," Selina said quietly. "No," his jaw worked, "but I sent them to London that week regardless, a matter that might have waited. I did not think—" He stopped again, and this time did not resume, and Selina understood that this was as far into the wound as he meant to walk tonight, and did not press him further. "The books needn't stay wrapped forever," she said instead, gently, offering him a door out of the darker room he had wandered into. "Beatrice might like to help unwrap them. Children find a particular joy in parcels, even old ones." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, and something in his face, guarded, always guarded, loosened by some fractional, precious degree. "You have a gift, Miss Montley, for making grief feel less like a wall and more like a room one might, eventually, walk through." "I have only a gift for sewing, Your Grace," she said, "and grief, I find, mends rather like torn cloth, slowly, stitch by stitch, and never so that the tear does not show at all, only so that it holds." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Selina knew something was wrong before she ever learned its contents, because the Duke did not ride out that morning, and the house that had held its breath for 8 months seemed, for the first time since her arrival, to hold it differently, not in grief now, but in dread. It was Hodges, in the end, who told her, in the careful, sideways manner of a servant who has decided a thing must be known but cannot properly be the one to say it outright. "Mr. Alaric Price has written, Miss, His Grace's cousin, second cousin, properly, on the late Duke's side. He has written to the Court of Chancery." "To what purpose?" Hodges's mouth thinned. "To question His Grace's fitness as guardian to Miss Beatrice, Miss, and, I don't doubt, to question who ought properly to manage her fortune until she comes of age, should His Grace be found wanting." Selina felt something cold settle beneath her ribs. She had met Mr. Price only once, at the edge of a dinner the Duke had reluctantly hosted for a passing solicitor, a smiling, comfortable man with soft hands and softer manners, who had asked after Beatrice's health with an attentiveness that had struck Selina, even then, as somehow rehearsed. She found the Duke that evening in the estate office, a room she had never before entered, and found him with Price's letter spread before him and a face gone the color of old paper. "He says I keep her in a house of ghosts," the Duke said, without looking up. "He says a silent, unhappy child is evidence enough of neglect, whatever the physicians may say of grief's natural course. He says," his voice caught, briefly, on something like fury or despair. She could not tell which. "He says a man who cannot speak more than 10 words to his own household in a 12-month is unfit to raise a child who cannot speak at all." "He is wrong," Selina said, with a fierceness that surprised her. "He may none the less persuade a court of it." The Duke's hand, she saw, was not quite steady where it rested on the desk. Price stands to gain her guardianship, and with it, control of her trust, until she is 1 and 20. He is not a monster, Miss Montley, which makes him more dangerous than one. He is only a man who has always believed himself entitled to more than he was given, and has finally found a lever long enough to move the world in his favor. Then we must find a lever of our own, Selina said, before she quite considered how forward the we might sound. The Duke looked up at her, and something in his exhausted face steadied, just slightly, at the word. We, he repeated, as though testing its weight. I had almost forgotten what it was to hear that word and believe it. It was Beatrice, in her own silent way, who led Selina to the answer, though neither of them knew it at the time. The child had taken to following Selina about the house's quieter corners in the weeks since the letter arrived, sensing, perhaps, the new current of worry beneath the household's careful calm, and it was on one such wandering afternoon that she led Selina by the hand, still without a word, but with unmistakable purpose, up a narrow servant's stair to an attic room Selina had not before seen. It was her parents' room. Selina understood this at once from the way Beatrice stood in the doorway and would go no further, her small hand tightening in Selina's own. Trunks stood along the walls, sheeted against dust, and a cradle that had never been used for a second child stood folded in one corner. "We needn't stay if it troubles you," Selina said softly. Beatrice shook her head, the first deliberate gesture of communication Selina had seen from her in a fortnight, and pointed, with grave certainty, at the smallest of the trunks. Inside, beneath folded linens gone soft with age, Selina found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath those, a single sealed letter addressed in a hand she recognized at once from the Duke's own correspondence, though shakier, as though written in haste or grief. "For my brother Julian, to be opened only should the worst befall us both." Her hands trembled as she carried it down to the estate office. The Duke broke the seal with fingers that would not quite hold steady, and read in silence for a long while before his breath left him in something between a laugh and a sob. He knew, the Duke said, Edmund knew, even then, that Price coveted what was never his to covet. He writes it plainly, that Price came to him twice, before ever the accident occurred, seeking to borrow against Beatrice's trust for gaming debts, and was twice refused. He writes that should anything befall himself and Charlotte, I am to be her guardian entire and unquestioned, and that Price is on no account to be trusted with so much as her pocket money, let alone her fortune. He looked up at Selina, and his eyes were bright with an emotion she had not yet seen him wear openly. It is dated a fortnight before the crossing. He knew, Miss Montley, he knew, and he trusted me, and I have spent 8 months believing myself unworthy of that trust, rather than remembering that he gave it. Then let the letter say what he could not say himself, Selina said gently. Let it speak for him now. There is a particular quality to hope newly returned to a house long without it, a lightness in the servant's step, a fire lit in a room long left cold, and Oakhaven Park, in the weeks that followed the discovery of Edmund's letter, began, by careful and unhurried degrees, to breathe again. The Duke instructed that the dry fountain be seen to, and stood himself in the forecourt one grey morning to watch the water finally spill from the cherub's shell, an oddly boyish satisfaction on his face that Selina, watching from the drawing-room window, found herself smiling at long after he had gone back within. Beatrice began, in fits and starts, to hum, wordless still, but hum, small snatches of the tune Selina sang over her needlework, and once, gloriously, to laugh outright at a kitten that had got itself thoroughly stuck in the stable-yard water-butt. And Selina found that her own days had rearranged themselves, without her quite noticing the shift, around the small, unremarkable hours she spent in the Duke's company, an afternoon spent unwrapping the library's parcelled books together, Beatrice between them tearing brown paper with fierce delight. An evening reading aloud by the fire while he mended, of all things, a broken toy horse with the same careful attention she gave to torn hems, because he had insisted, gruffly, that he ought to learn some small use besides estate ledgers and chancery correspondence. "You are very bad at this," she told him, watching him fumble with a length of glue and a wooden leg. "I am accustomed to problems that yield to force of will rather than delicacy," he admitted, not looking up. "You will have to teach me the other kind." "I have been teaching you the other kind for 2 months, Your Grace." He looked up at that, and something passed between them that neither named, not yet. A warmth that had crept in so gradually that Selina could not have said on what day it arrived, only that it was, unmistakably, there. "Julian," he said quietly, "I think, after 2 months, you might call me Julian when we are private." "Julian," she repeated, and felt the name settle into her like a stone dropped into still water, sending its rings outward long after the sound of it had faded. Chancery, when at last the matter came before it, proved a colder and more tedious business than Selina's imagination had painted. A small panel room, a magistrate with tired eyes, Price's solicitor reading aloud a list of grievances that made the Duke sound, on paper, very like the cold and broken recluse society had always believed him. But paper, Selina had learned, could be answered with paper of its own. Edmund's letter was read into the record in a silence so complete that Selina could hear her own heartbeat. The magistrate's tired eyes sharpened as the dead man's words unfolded Price's history of debts and refused loans, dated and specific, corroborated, the Duke's solicitor had been thorough, by 2 independent creditors willing to swear to the very sums Edmund had named. Price's composure, so smooth and rehearsed a moment before, cracked by careful degrees as the letter was read, and by its end he sat with the stiff, furious stillness of a man who has watched his lever crumble in his hand. "There is also," the Duke's solicitor said quietly into the hush that followed, "the testimony of Miss Beatrice Ashworth's companion, who has observed the child directly these past 3 months, and who is prepared to speak to the considerable improvement in her spirits under her uncle's roof." Selina rose when her name was called, and found, to her own surprise, that the old paralysis of the ballroom did not come to claim her, that she had, somewhere in the quiet rooms of Oakhaven Park, mislaid the fear that had once kept her folded small behind potted ferns. "She was silent when I came to her," Selina said, to the magistrate rather than to the room, because his was the only judgment that mattered. "She is not silent now in every hour. She hums, she laughs, on occasion, at a kitten or a joke poorly told. She points, and she reaches for a hand, and last week she took up a needle of her own accord and hemmed a doll's gown entire, without help, and held it up to show her uncle, with an expression of such pride that he wept before her, quite without shame, which I believe did more to mend her than any physician's draught could have done. A house does not heal because grief is forbidden it. It heals because someone stays. His Grace has stayed. I have watched him stay, every day, at some cost to himself that he has never once spoken of aloud, and I would stake whatever small credibility a companion's word carries that no court in England could find a guardian more entire in his devotion. The magistrate's ruling, when it came, was neither swift nor showy. These things rarely are, but it was, in the end, entire in the Duke's favor, and Price left the panel room a smaller man than he had entered it, his schemes laid open on paper he could not now unwrite. They walked in the garden that evening, the 3 of them, in the soft gold light of a summer's ending, and Beatrice ran ahead along the gravel path, chasing a moth with the unrestrained joy of a child who has, at last, remembered how to simply be a child. "I owe you a debt I cannot properly reckon," the Duke said, watching his niece, rather than Selina, as though it were easier to speak, while looking elsewhere. "You found the letter that saved her fortune. You spoke for her before a room that might otherwise have taken her from the only home she has left. You have given her back her voice, near enough, and given me back." He stopped. "Given you back what, Julian?" He turned to look at her then, and whatever guard he had worn so long and so carefully seemed, in that golden light, to simply fall away. "Myself," he said, or some better version of myself than the one that has haunted these halls these 8 months. I did not know a house could be so heavy with silence until you filled it, room by room, with something gentler. I did not know I could still feel. His voice caught. I did not know I could still feel anything at all, Selina, until I found myself waiting each evening for the particular sound of your step in the corridor, and counting the hours until I might reasonably hear it. Selina's breath left her in something unsteady. I have been counting them too, she admitted, and telling myself it was only the ordinary fondness one feels for a household one has come to serve. Is that all it is? No, she said. I do not think it is that at all. He took her hand then, not with the sudden heat of a stolen kiss in some novel's careless chapter, but slowly, carefully, the way one might pick up something precious and long broken, uncertain whether it would bear the weight of being held. I have very little practice left in this, he said. I find I have forgotten how a man is meant to ask for a woman's heart when he has spent so long believing himself unworthy of holding anyone's at all. You might simply ask, Selina said, smiling despite the unsteadiness in her own chest. I have found, these past months, that plain honesty mends more than any pretty speech. Then plainly, he said, and honestly, I love you, Selina Montley. I loved you, I think, before I properly understood that I was permitted to love anything again. Will you stay at Oakhaven, not as a companion hired to mend what is torn, but as its mistress, and let me spend whatever years are given us, proving I understood the gift of you rightly? Ahead of them, Beatrice had abandoned her moth and turned back to watch, silent and solemn and bright-eyed, and it was she who broke the moment, not with words, not yet, but by running back to them and taking a hand of each, linking uncle and companion together with her own small grip, as though sealing something she alone had understood was already, quietly, true. Yes, Selina said, laughing through sudden tears. Yes, Julian, I will stay. The wedding was small, at the Duke's particular wish and Selina's grateful agreement. No grand spectacle of society come to gawk at the transformation of the feared recluse and his plain companion. Only the chapel at Oakhaven, filled with those who had watched the house learn, slowly, to breathe again. Mrs. Pruitt wept without shame through the whole of the ceremony. Hodges, ever correct, allowed himself exactly one visible tear, dabbed away with a handkerchief pressed for the occasion. Selina's mother sat in the front pew with an expression that had finally settled, fully, into pride, unclouded now by any pity at all. And Beatrice stood at the front in a gown Selina had made her with her own hands, every stitch even, every hem sure, no crookedness at all this time, for the girl had grown steady enough in her grief to steady the needle too, under Selina's teaching, over long companionable afternoons, and when the vicar asked, at the ceremony's close, whether any present wished to bless the union, it was Beatrice who stepped forward, small and solemn in the hush of the chapel. I bless it, she said, 2 words, plain and clear and entirely her own, the first anyone had heard her speak in nearly a year, and the chapel dissolved into a joy so complete, so unguarded, that even the Duke, who had schooled himself for 8 long months against the indulgence of open feeling, wept without any attempt to hide it, his wife's hand in his and his niece's voice, restored, ringing still in the rafters above them. Epilogue. A house made whole. Oakhaven Park, in the years that followed, became known in the county not for its former ghost story silence, but for its gardens, restored bed by bed under the new Duchess's careful hand, and for its library, unwrapped entire now and read through by a girl who had once been thought uncanny and was now simply, happily, a chattering, curious child of 9, who read aloud to her uncle by the fire, each evening, whether he wished it or not. The fountain in the forecourt ran all that summer and every summer after, and visitors who came to Oakhaven remarked, invariably, on how alive the old house felt, how the fires seemed always lit, how laughter seemed to travel down corridors that had once held only silence. Selina Montley, who had spent so many years believing herself unseen, found in the end that she had been the one doing the seeing all along, noticing the small, overlooked truths that others walked past too quickly to find. A child's grief mistaken for strangeness, A man's devotion, mistaken for coldness, a torn hem, mended so carefully that, in time, no one could say quite where the tear had been. And in the quiet hours after Beatrice was asleep and the house had settled into its evening hush, Julian would often find his wife in the library with her needlework, and would sit beside her not to speak, most evenings, but simply to be near, for they had learned, both of them, in the long, slow season of the house's healing, that love was rarely a single dramatic word. It was, instead, 10,000 small and patient stitches, sewn quietly, day after day, until what had once been broken held, not perfectly, not without its faint and honest scars, but held all the same, warm and whole and entirely, gratefully, home.